looks like we're reconvening. Thank you for coming back up so promptly. I appreciate it so we can stay reasonably on time. Before we open the session, one of the guests we have here today is Jane Aiken from the National Endowment for Humanities. And as I mentioned earlier, the National Endowment is funding this conference. And so she wanted to say a quick hello. So
Yes, I don't get to go to many conferences, and so I certainly want to take this opportunity to say hi to everybody. Some of you I've known for many years, many of you I haven't met yet. I hope to meet you all in the course of the conference. And I want to tell you just how special this conference is. This came out of the Collaborative Research Program in the Division of Research Programs at NEH. We fund very few conferences because we don't get good conference applications all the time. But this time, this application came through, and Jim Conley, who had been a project director before in the research division, had talked to me about, I think, when we met at a conference a few years ago.
Hosted by Christine.
And that's it. And the application came through. It turned out to be an excellent application. Our evaluators were happy with it. So you are attending one of the very few conferences that we provided funding for this year and in previous years. And so I just want you to know how special this is and how great a job Ball State is doing.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Scott Steffen. I'm here at the Department of History at Ball State University, and I want to welcome you to our second session, The Development of American Print Culture. I guess I will take these in order here. First, we will have a presentation from Robb Haberman. He comes to us. He's currently teaching at the University of Denver. He received his PhD in May of 2009 from the University of Connecticut. The title of that dissertation was Periodical Publics, Magazines and Literary Networks in Post-Revolutionary America. He has published in American Periodicals and Early American Studies. One of the intriguing titles he had here was a publication on the Historical Violence Database and Historical Methods. There's not too much violence in our paper today, as you'll find out, although there is one death. But this is an intriguing title here. So without further ado, Robb's paper is, If You Judge the Following Piece of Country Produce Worthy a Place in Your Magazine, Please to Insert It, Writing from the Margins in 1790s Massachusetts. You take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start out by thanking Scott for providing comments and the conference organizers. Thank you so much, Jim. Also, Melanie for schlepping to the airport and giving me a ride to Ball State. So my talk today looks at Benjamin Bridge, a figure who I doubt anyone has heard of here, but I think looking at Bridge is significant because his literary activities, I think, shed light on other aspects of authorship, writing, and entering the realm of print as other individuals did in the post-revolutionary era. And for Bridge, magazines really played a crucial role for his cultivation of an authorial identity. But what I found is that looking at magazines, at Bridge's submissions to the Massachusetts Magazine, a periodical that was published in Boston from 1789 to 1796, that looking at Bridge's appearances in this particular publication is not enough. That in addition to his periodical contributions, that you have to look at his other literary activities, most notably his scribal publication, which is the focus of this paper. And I found that looking at the magazine, his magazine writings, and looking at his manuscript volume, how there are numerous connections with both of these formats, and both of them are significant in terms of his creation of an authorial identity. And I'd like to take my time now to discuss how Bridge and his scribal volume and his magazine writing sheds light on broader literary activities of the post-revolutionary era. And I'd like to begin by discussing this issue of networks and region. In the previous panel, there was quite a focus on the social networks that developed in early modern or late agrarian, in the late agrarian era. And networks continued to play a crucial role in late 18th century America. And you can see this not just with Bridge, but I'd like to compare Bridge to another individual who I'm studying, Richard Bingham Davis. Davis is a poet living in New York. Like Bridge, he's a relatively young man. He's only 6 years older than Bridge. So in 1792, he's 24 years old. And like Bridge, Davis also suffers an early death. He contracts yellow fever in the fall of 1799 and dies shortly thereafter. And it's interesting because Davis contributes numerous writings, both essays and poems, to New York periodicals. His writings appear in 8 different periodical publications in the early 1790s, and these are all New York newspapers and magazines. Yet what I found is that Davis, like Bridge, ultimately cultivates his authorial persona not just through the magazines themselves, but through a combination of the magazines and his other literary activities. So, for instance, Davis was a founding member and secretary of the Calliopean Society, which was a leading literary club in New York in the 1790s. And Davis produced dozens of pieces for the Calliopean Society, which he presented his works, and they were duly entered in the scribal publication, or I should say scribal publications that were kept by the club itself. And many of these works were later submitted and appeared in the New York Magazine and other local periodicals. In addition to his work with the Calliopean Society, Davis was involved with the Tammany Society, the prominent civic club in New York, and he also wrote many pieces for the New York stage as well. Several of his poems appeared as prologues and epilogues for noted productions for New York's theater at the time. And 2 of his key writings that appeared in multiple venues include an ode to George Washington that he produced for the Tammany Society and later appeared in numerous newspapers as well as on the stage, as well as he wrote a celebratory poem for the 7th anniversary of the Calliopean Society. And he read this aloud at the Calliopean's anniversary celebration, and likewise it appeared in different periodical publications of the time. So the idea here is that, to bring it back to Bridge, is the notion of gaining public prominence, gaining authorial reputation, was not just achieved by magazine authorship alone. Rather, it's significant to look at the connections of these periodical productions with the other social activities, literary and civic clubs, the theater as well. And this goes back to the idea of networks as being key for understanding authorship during this time. And with the theme of the conference being print culture beyond the metropolis, one thing I was thinking regarding Bridge is originally I thought, well, Bridge is somewhat of a yokel living in Worcester, Massachusetts, and therefore he had to rely strictly on his scribal volume in conjunction with his pieces appearing in the Massachusetts Magazine as a way of gaining prominence, of cultivating his reputation. But then I thought, it's not just simply a matter of someone like Davis living in the city and is able to cultivate more of a reputation through these multiple venues, while Bridge is in the countryside and he's more circumscribed in the opportunities to gain a public presence as a writer. I think what is key here is more the access to these networks themselves and the ability of individual writers to tap into these existing civic institutions and literary activities that existed within their communities. As I mentioned in the paper, Bridge does have, there is a local literary club, the Minervan Society, that is active right outside, that is active in Worcester County, right outside of Worcester proper. Bridge, however, is not a member of this organization. So the idea here is it's not just a matter of Bridge is more circumscribed because he's living in the countryside. I think, unlike Davis, Bridge is, has less opportunity or is not as successful, again, into joining these existing networks. Secondly, I'd like to mention or discuss this idea of looking at men and women's participation as magazine authors. And I think regarding the literature that has been produced in post-revolutionary America, there's a focus there among scholars to identify women's literary activities as mostly taking place in a non-printed realm. And this is particularly true for women residing in the Delaware Valley, individuals like Elizabeth Grant Ferguson, Annis Boudinot Stockton. When talking about the significance of their writing activities, most scholars tend to focus on commonplacing, on correspondence and conversation, on these non-print activities. I think that to gain a better understanding of even the social dynamics, though, of their literary activities, is you have to consider the fact that these women writers were also heavily contributing to magazines during this time as well. For instance, Elizabeth Grant Ferguson had 28 pieces appear in the Columbian magazine in the late 1780s and early 1790s. And 28 pieces might not seem that impressive, but to offer a broader perspective on this, let's bear in mind that the leading contributor to the Columbian magazine during this time was Jeremy Belknap, who himself had 32 pieces appear in the Columbian magazine. And we have Elizabeth Grant Ferguson has 28 of her poems appear in this periodical. So I think a better way of understanding the significance of women's literary activities is to incorporate the realm of print in addition to these manuscript and oral modes of communications. Likewise, I think that we need to focus more on manuscript production for men both as individuals, and this is I demonstrated with Benjamin Bridges' scribal volume, as well as men writing for literary clubs, debating societies during this time. That there were literally dozens, if not hundreds, of manuscript volumes that were produced through such club activities. Finally, my work on Bridge has been heavily influenced by Richard Brown's article, which looks at the urbanization of the Massachusetts countryside in the early national era. And one aspect I'd like to point out is that Brown points out that the growing commercial and cosmopolitan and civic growth of these rural towns and communities, not just in Massachusetts, but throughout New England, that this broke down the older ties of church and family that were, the basic bonds of identity and affiliation in the colonial and revolutionary eras. And I think what's interesting here, looking at Bridge, is that ultimately his writing for the Massachusetts Magazine and the scribal volume that resulted as well, if anything, this reinforces the ties that Bridge had with his local community, particularly with his family and the church. And I want to finish off by reading you one of Bridge's poems. I apologize for the blurry images that I provided in the paper. Unfortunately, at the time, I only had a very limited time to actually take the photos, and as you can see, I was using not the best quality digital camera. But I do want to read to you the Universal Hallelujah. And the Universal Hallelujah is the poem that appears in the scribal volume that Bridge produced, but that did not appear in the Massachusetts Magazine itself. So it was not a printed piece. So this is the Universal Hallelujah. Praise the Lord with joyful tongue, ye powers that guard his throne. Jesus the man shall lead the song, that good inspire the tune. Gabriel and all the immortal choir that fills the realms above, sing, for he formed you of his fire and fills you with his love. Shine low his praise, ye crystal skies, the floor of his abode, or veil your little twinkling eyes before a brighter God. The restless globe of golden light, whose beams create our days, join with the silver queen of night to own your borrowed rays. Blush and refund the honors paid to your inferior names. Tell the blind world you are fed orbs by his overflowing flames. Winds ye shall bear his name aloud through the ethereal blue, for when his chariot is a cloud, he makes his wheels of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presenters are Mary Zboray and Ronald Zboray. They come to us from the University of Pittsburgh. Individually and collectively, they have published a great deal. The two books that most folks will probably recognize, and I checked out from the Ball State Library, so when folks investigate later, they'll know what faculty were reading. A Fictive People, Antebellum Economic Development in the American Reading Public. And together they have more recently authored Literary Dollars and Social Sense, A People's History of the Mass Market Book. And even more recently, Everyday Ideas, Socio-Literary Experience Among Antebellum New Englanders, and Voices Without Votes, Women and Politics in Antebellum New England. I will add, as one personal aside, when I was doing research at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill this summer at the Southern Historical Collection, I came across a manuscript collection, and it had a copy request from the Zborays in it. I knew I was onto something good. We will find out here today that they have been working their way really around the country, it sounds like, in order to collect the materials for our presentation today and for a broader monograph study. Today's presentation is Beyond the Market and the City, the Informal Dissemination of Reading Materials During the Civil War.
Thank you, Scott, for that very nice introduction. And thank you, Jim, for inviting us to this conference. We're very happy to take part in it. A little bit of information on the background of this project. As Scott has already told you, we've published books on earlier periods of reading histories in the United States. We wanted to see, though, what happened after the antebellum period and move into the Civil War era. So this is a little bit of a preview of our book in progress called The Bullet in the Book, Cultures of Reading During the Civil War. It's also the product, the larger product, and which you will see represented here, of 96 archives in the country and over 5,000 diary volumes and individual pieces of correspondence. So while we were reviewing our research for this paper, we were struck by the differences in the ways that people acquired print within the metropolis and the ways they acquired it outside of the metropolis during the Civil War era. And two people really stood out to us. One of them, you'll see pictured here, Ann North, lived in Washoe, Nevada territory with her husband, a mining entrepreneur. And she was always starved for print. Washoe was sparsely settled in 1863, and it produced only one paper, the Washoe Times. That you can see the way it looked, and that's a page from the Times. It has a lot of literary work on it, something like your magazines, Rob. She eagerly snatched this paper up. She subscribed to it, and one other paper from St. Paul. But her bill for subscriptions and for shipping in books was getting quite extravagant, and it cut into other expenses. So she would write home to her parents and say, "Send me whatever you can," from Syracuse, New York. So she got Eastern magazines, and you'll see some pictured here: Ballew's Dollar Monthly, Demarest Illustrated, and Godey's Ladies Books. Her parents would also express in books for her children, and I think for her too. And she had a little reading circle that she formed, and she would read aloud these books. At the opposite end of the pole between scarcity and abundance is Horatio Taft, who was a clerk who lived in Washington, D.C. And unlike Anne, he was really swimming in periodicals. He talked about how he would wake up in the morning and hear the newsboys crying out, the New York Herald, New York Times, New York Tribune. These came in through the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. You see a picture of it here. When he wanted respite from the noisy streets filled with news-obsessed readers, not unlike what you'll see here pictured of Broadway, New York, he went to the Willard's Hotel, where newspapers were plentiful, and you could sit down and read newspapers, and I believe he bought them there too. Anne would have marveled at his bounty. But the two newsreaders, and news was the most important form of reading material during the Civil War, one far beyond the metropolis and one deep inside it, experienced the extreme ends of the spectrum from scarcity to abundance of print. Horatio and Anne were but two of the many people whose diaries and letters we read, about 1,100 people in all, for our project in progress on the Civil War reading. As we were scanning these personal papers, we discovered that it was through friends and family members' informal loans and gifts, like the one Anne received, not commercial venues or lending institutions, that our readers most frequently acquired reading materials. It should really not have surprised us, because less than 20% of all Americans lived in urban areas at the time. And then most of the soldiers who were deployed to fight were in combat areas in the South and in towns and even in the wilderness. Most people were operating then, like Anne, outside the metropolis. We argued in our paper that readers beyond the metropolis managed to avail themselves through informal dissemination of a wide array of print matter that helped them counterbalance commercial and institutional print scarcity. This kind of circulation did not simply supplement formal distribution, for it fostered an entirely different communications environment than that which characterized commercial and institutional dissemination. Informally distributed items lost some of their impersonality as commodities because the channels through which they flowed were heavily mediated by interpersonal and group interactions. Examples of informal dissemination, these are the most widely used that we saw, were transient papers, and those were papers sent by individuals, not by printers or publishers. Clippings and extracts from newspapers or magazines that were stuffed into envelopes, gifts and personal loans, items that were scavenged, and swapped newspapers on the picket lines. Transient papers, the most plentiful source, served as surrogates for writing, and it was a way of keeping lines of communication flowing. You would just send a paper. It was cheaper than sending a letter. To send a transient paper, somebody had to write the recipient's name and address, and nothing more, because postal law did not allow that. You had to pay letter rate then, on an open-ended wrapper, put stamps on it, and then go to a post office and mail it. To the left of this next image, you'll see two examples of stamped wrappers. One is directed to Tuskegee, Alabama, and one to Pleasantville, I believe, North Carolina. The lower wrapper is made up of recycled wallpaper because the paper was getting short in the South during the war, and much more expensive too. Paper shortages in Texas necessitated fashioning the skimpy wrapper band that you see on the right. Transient papers were valued by soldiers especially because they filled a void commercially vended print could not. And here's a quote, one of our favorite. "Send me a San Antonio newspaper with social news," a Texas captain asked his folks. "Anything that comes from San Antonio makes my heart glad." In a similar vein, Charlotte Fortin, a black teacher in the Union-occupied Sea Islands, relished an abolitionist paper sent from friends in Salem, Mass. "In Miss Town's box came my parcel so long looked for, containing a Liberator, the first that I have seen since leaving home. It is as familiar and delightful to look upon as the face of an old friend." Union soldiers sent periodicals as well from the towns in which they camped, and sometimes they were near cities, so they were able to send products in Metropolis home. And people at home would not have normally seen these papers. They took them to Regimental Post Office, which was a link on the chain of postal stations that eventually led to Washington, D.C. as a distribution center, and then they would find their home front destinations. "I will send you the Nashville Union. It is one of the best Union papers printed in the South," one sergeant wrote his wife in Lafayette, Indiana. In this way, then, rural civilians acquired a diversity of publications marked with a unique social imprint of a loved one striving to maintain relations at a distance. I'm going to hand it over to Ron now.
And I'll stand up, so I'm not that kind of guy. We'll talk about next print and envelopes, which is the next section. And this will include newspaper clippings and handwritten extracts of printed material. And what's important to realize about this is that the clips and extracts bear traces of the sender. Selection, careful cutting, marginalia, painstaking transcription. So this affords them a great deal of power. And for sending, reasons for sending enclosure, first of all, is that it was more secure. We had several cases where people were sending papers and they were getting stolen. So if you put a clip in an envelope, it's going to be less likely to go astray. So here we have John Harper writing to his son in Virginia. "As most of the newspapers I sent you do not reach you, I will enclose this." But there's a deeper reason, too. People are sharing the context of their lives. And this flow goes both ways, sometimes from the battlefront to home, sometimes home to the battlefront. Here we have a woman in Ohio writing to her son, "You speak of troubling me with these scraps. Don't think so. Everything that affects you in any way interests me." And so what's going on here is that to send a clip is to dingbat the clip, to say, this is important to me, I want you to read this. And here you have some images of enclosures and letters. There's a lot of these one-page sheets that are circulating in these envelopes. Another example of this is from a Minnesota soldier in Helena, Arkansas, writing back home. A soldier's appeal, and one of these little clips in which you can read it across this way. "I always did intend to take me a wife." If you read it this way, "I always did intend single my life to spend." And the whole thing just plays out that way. And of course, he's writing home to his wife, and it's all part of the marital relationship. Another way to get material around was simply to copy it out, especially if you didn't want to lose the original. And here's a good case of a Swiss immigrant, Mary Isley, writing to her husband. I took up your hymn book and opened it by a guess, and the first hymn that presented itself to my eyes was this: I will copy for it. Done my soul good, expressed exactly my feelings, and therefore I think it will do you good also. So she just took the Bible, opened it up randomly, and copied what she found. And it had meaning. And you can see throughout the correspondence a great deal of this extracting that's going on as a way of getting material around. Another way was gifting and lending. Because there's the conditions of scarcity beyond Metropolis for varying reasons. So gift giving and lending is one way to augment the local store of available printed matter, especially books and magazine. This is often done face-to-face, but there's also the use of express companies in addition to the mails. This is one of the great unwritten chapters in the circulation of print, are these private express companies in the Civil War. Most literary gifts in the Civil War era are occasional and conferred upon children or young adults, always going down, it seems. But those in need could receive them from metropolitan areas any time of the year, especially Western families. The classic Harper's cover of A Christmas, and the child here is, I could use the, no I can't, here it is, opening up a book here. Out in California, there's a Mexican-American 16-year-old who receives a gift. Somebody just visits, brings the Count of Monte Cristo out to her isolated ranch by a local judge, and then she began reading it immediately. It became part of her life. Very common. Here's the other side of it, Christmas in camp. The soldiers receiving items. Here, a corporal from Minnesota, James Bowler, is writing that his colonel made me a volume of Shakespeare as a present. The colonel is a dear friend to me, but he estimates me far above my real worth. And you can see here that there's newspapers underneath the image of Santa Claus, and which happens to be Harper's Weekly, where this appeared. This is even a better one. This is a box being opened, and there are books that are right in front here. The books were often tipped into these boxes that the express companies brought out to the soldiers. I mean, they did pies and stuff that you can't imagine would be shipped. And this is the distribution point in Virginia where everything went, City Point, before it went to the rest of the country. And this is another image. There's a great deal of borrowing among the soldiers, and this is a yellow novel by Eugene Sue, The Mysteries of the People. And he's put this is Edwin Augustus Lee from the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, he's put his name on this so that when it circulates, it can come back to the owner. One of our interesting characters is Christian A. Fleetwood, African-American sergeant major. And he borrowed, we went through his diary for 1864, the Count of Monte Cristo again, Atlantic Monthly, Harper's Monthly, Glee Book, Hates and Loves the Woman, Bertrand Noel. But then he himself would subscribe to African-American journals. And here's a detail from his diary from the Library of Congress. Right down here, borrowed Atlantic Monthly from Captain C. And this goes all the way through his diary. We're also looking at how print is acquired in enemy confrontations, because this is a way of getting print that wouldn't normally go to places that it would go to. So there's face-to-face exchange, other kinds of immediate acquisition. Print is lost on battlefields, discarded on army routes, abandoned at plantations, pilfered from personal libraries. And what's interesting, we're tracing how this enters the social life of the scavengers afterwards. These become sucked into the family world. And one of the classic instances of this is swapping newspaper by military personnel across picket lines. This is an image of one of these searches by Union soldiers for contraband information, but they would often take books to send home. And here you have Mary Dulaney from Upperville, Virginia, very small town. In the library, they broke open the oak bookcase, threw everything out of it over the floor, took the books, paper, etc., and took some of the handsome books from the table. So they're just not taking things that are really contraband. They're just grabbing anything they can. A good image of a sketch of the sack of Fredericksburg. When trains went by and there were needy soldiers, people would often throw the papers from the train. This is a great case of the desire for news on the part of the soldiers. And you could see in the background the wheels of the train going by. It is by Winslow Homer. There are all sorts of relics that come out of the Civil War battlefields, and especially Bibles. And we have a lot of soldiers saying, I don't want my Bible to fall in the hands of somebody, especially if I have your letters inside the Bible. This Bible we just saw has an inscription. This book was taken out of a dead rebel officer's pocket, 7th day, September 1862, battle fought on the banks of Antietam. Scavenging newspapers all over. If you could have newspapers just flying around, they'd find owners. Here you have John Washington, a slave who's escaping in Stafford County, Virginia. I had stuffed my pockets full of rebel newspapers, and I distributed them around as far as they would go, greatly to the delight of the men. He means the Union troops. And by this act, won their good opinions right away. And here's the newspaper exchange. Here, a Georgia infantryman, a dirt farmer, talks about 2 of the 2nd Vermont regiments swam over to us today and exchanged papers. Then he reflects. Pickett's acts quite different now from what they did last year. Then we were shooting at each other, every side of each other. One of the officers in this case simply said to his men, if you see the enemy, shoot him. Don't exchange papers with him. And this is an image from Harper's of the newspaper exchange. We have a Northern Zouave, and this is a Confederate, and they're both reading each other's newspapers on the battle lines. So, our conclusion. The war changed the face of dissemination in that it made informal ways of circulating print more important than ever before. And as we progress with the research, we're beginning to understand that there's a media culture in the Civil War providing a new environment for amateur production, informal dissemination, and common folks reception practices. Thank you.
Thank you. I've prepared some comments here, so I'll give those, and I'll go in order here of the 2 papers, and then try and bring them back together. They're framed by my own research, as you'll gather between the lines here, that deals with Southern religious newspapers in the Civil War era. I can see why Jim used the broad title for this panel, Development of American Print Culture. Indeed, there seem to be many contrasts at play in these 2 papers. Robb Haberman's paper showcases a young author constructing the contented mind in 1790s Massachusetts, while Mary and Ronald Zboray's essay catapults us into the Civil War, where the focus rests on the dissemination and consumption of print culture. In spite of these differences, a number of commonalities emerge. Both papers highlight the connections among readers and authors beyond the city, but they also highlight the ways in which masculinity, class, and religion shaped American culture in this period. With Robb's paper, I think many of us can identify with Benjamin Bridge, particularly when he learned that the editor of the Massachusetts Magazine rejected his piece, Morning Walk in May. As you read the paper, undeterred, young Bridges gave it the best spin possible in his copybook, quoting the editor's backhanded compliment, "It was by no means a poetical ramble." I think I've seen that on some of the commentary to my submissions. The very attempt to publish with mixed results showcases Benjamin Bridges' maturation in the early Republic. Indeed, his identity seems inextricably tied to his efforts at publishing in the Massachusetts Magazine. As Robb notes, Bridges' construction of a copybook with such fanfare and ornamentation suggests his intimate attachment to the book itself and the pride in his authorship. We learned that Benjamin published in a leading magazine of the day, 700 subscribers and counting, which sounds pretty significant at this period, right? That aimed to enrich the mind as it sidestepped political content. As the title of his pieces suggests, such as the republished On the Vanity of Riches and the unpublished Universal Hallelujah, which we got to hear, Benjamin's writings aimed to instruct and entertain while depicting the countryside of his residence, according to Robb, as the seat of moral virtue, innocent amusement, and economic stability. We also see that Bridges set out to distinguish himself as a regular contributor rather than a one-time author, and that his interactions with the editors illustrated growing confidence in himself and his endeavors. Near the close of the piece, Robb illustrates how this constructed self fit into the context of 1790s Massachusetts. We learn that this young man came from a well-established, well-connected family, but he was the youngest son in a fairly large family. He had apprenticed to a legal career from which it appears he vicariously escaped through his writing, only to die at the age of 22. Particularly as the paper closed, I wanted to know more about the content of Bridges' writing and the context in which he lived, so that I might gain a better sense of the imaginary world he inhabited in his copybook. Indeed, I inquired if Robb could lend me a couple of Bridges' writings, which he kindly did. Some things that I noticed as I took a look at some of the writings. As I read The Vanity of the Riches and a couple of his poems, a dichotomy emerged. On one hand, Bridges sounds very Franklinian. Hard work and self-discipline generate wealth, happiness, and bountiful crops. No doubt, Bridges underlines God's goodness to a greater degree than Franklin, and Bridges' poetry also seeks to evoke that goodness for his reader, with phrases such as twinkling eyes and the silver queen of night. But amid this rich and orderly world rests uncertainty. In his piece on wealth, Bridges notes that individuals might enter into poverty due to mere bad luck, not merely imprudence or rum, which seem to be the top two variables for most folks in his mind. This leads Bridges to counsel greater reliance on God and to argue that a medium between poverty and affluence would be the most likely to produce a contented mind in the virtuous man. This mix of order and chance, of rationalism and sentiment, made me wonder how his writing reflected this particular juncture in the early Republic in New England. Likewise, Robb's list of items in the Massachusetts Magazine Index, which included everything from history to romances, suggests an attempt to craft an American sensibility that intertwined intellect and emotion and paved the way for reader engagement. Does this range of material suggest an attempt to market to a broad readership or an attempt to encapsulate the ideal values of an ideal man? In terms of class and family, it was clear that the Bridges family enjoyed some prosperity amid deep ties to the broader community of Worcester. And yet, as the youngest son, that prosperity may have seemed elusive. I wondered, did publishing compete with his interest in law, as Robb suggests in the paper, or could he have seen it as complementary? It seems that acceptance into the world of letters might have given him a leg up in the crowded legal profession of his day, when few writers made a living exclusively with their pen. Beyond mere networking, his access to letters and writing may have illustrated his own desire for social advancement. His story also suggests the economic vagaries of the period, at least to me, while studies such as Joyce Appleby's Inheriting the Revolution illustrate how young men on the make, like this, landed on their feet more often than not. Amid the early republic's economic dynamism, this story concludes with a much more ambiguous result: a wealth of ideas and a poverty of worldly riches, at least for this young man who died too young. More broadly, his emphasis on writing illustrates his own efforts at refinement amid the competition for employment and publication. Richard Bushman reminds us that the quest for refined intellectual pursuits often defined middle-class purpose in this era, even as Americans professed disdain for the superficiality and uselessness of seemingly genteel persuasions. Perhaps Bridges' writing reflects this transitional era. I also wondered how masculinity might factor into the production and distribution of his ideas. And he began to develop this today, so I think we can build on this too, in the comparison with the other author from New York. I'm struck by the fact that Benjamin took criticism in stride, and how well he took it in stride. Since he lived in the hinterland, as Robb points out, I wondered if Bridges worked through early drafts with men in Worcester, and how his linkage to the literati in Boston may have given him standing in his hometown. Where Robb centers his study on the construction of the authorial self in an era of growing access to literature and newspapers, Mary and Ronald Zboray reveal a society of readers consuming news amid the tumult of the Civil War. Torn from everyday work and relations during the war, soldiers and civilians craved normalcy, or as they put it, papers were instrumental to maintaining social ties in a time of turmoil. When all else failed, letters or care packages might not catch up to men on the move. Americans could hope to get their hands on a newspaper from their hometown. Amid the chaos of troop movements, battles, and attacks across the southern landscape, the papers also offered information, however inaccurate or partial this may have been. The Zborays illustrate the novel ways that Americans shared and delivered print across the vast nation. This is the real point. The transient papers, the clippings, and the lending copies. There may have been publishing hubs such as Nashville or New York, but there were countless spokes too. We see the preciousness of text, particularly as it became increasingly scarce during the war. the many ways it created communities among civilians and soldiers. In terms of this particular context, I had some questions and some issues here surrounding the Civil War. Scholars such as James McPherson have touched on the unique qualities of Civil War armies. These men were highly literate. These men served in regiments formed from their communities, and they cherished American democratic ideals, differently defined perhaps. The Zborays confirm McPherson's findings that soldiers did not stop being citizens once they donned uniforms and had rifles in hand. But the Zborays also highlight how the psychological space between battlefront and home front could be closed by the free flow of information. Particularly true in this war because there really was no effective military censorship. Under the broad heading of morale on the battlefield and home front, a couple of interrelated issues emerge. Particularly with Civil War armies, where the bulk of soldiers were volunteers and not conscripts, scholars have noted the delicate balance between the military's need for hierarchy and soldiers imbued with democratic ideals. We see tantalizing examples of both here. For example, they illustrate well-educated and well-to-do officers carefully controlling and disseminating who had access to their lending libraries. So there's a real sense of clubbiness, I think, in that sense. Yet we also see men in the ranks eagerly sharing, and I think your image of men grabbing materials off the trains illustrates this vividly, disseminating very widely any information they had from their home. Yet we... whether Union or Confederate troops, I wondered how reading and text served to unify and divide troops as we imagine internal cohesiveness here among these units and what took place. This ebb and flow of information did not halt along the picket lines. Indeed, soldiers in blue and gray traded reading materials right along with their tobacco and coffee. Although limited to one rich example from a Georgia private, which is highlighted here, Mary and Ronald suggest that such moments of intellectual fraternization became more readily available over time. In this account, the soldier noted that this occurred in 1863, but it would not have happened sooner. As they move forward, this opens up the important issue of how combatants viewed their enemy over time and the ways in which reading materials and habits shaped perceptions of the enemy. Of course, the cause was always in flux. Since soldiers regularly consumed information about politics on the home front, this raises the question of how news and letters reshape military and civilian attitudes, if we indeed have this free flow of exchange of ideas. This seems especially important in the Midwest, where Democrats and Republicans competed fiercely to vindicate their version of military and political events. On the southern side, where Confederates claimed they were all of one party, if not of one mind, just ask the Vice President of the Confederacy, how did news and information from home reshape soldiers' attitudes? What was taking place in this exchange, and how did it shape attitudes? I also noticed that many of your examples are also from areas where guerrilla activity is taking place in, say, eastern Tennessee, highly contested areas like Virginia that are going back and forth. And I wondered, those areas, too, the narrative would seem more complicated, distribution more complicated as well. Southern historians have long touched on the ways in which Union occupation disrupted Confederate transportation and postal operations. If, as you convincingly argue here, newsprint and text remained precious to soldiers, what impact did the absence and irregular delivery of materials make for morale, especially of Confederate soldiers, as their trains are taken and they are occupied by the Union Army? I also wanted to know more about the ways in which Southerners tried to fill gaps created by the war, including subscription payments, where many Southern newspapers constantly increased their price and altered acceptable forms of payment. So at some point there has to be that creation, and at least since I'm on more the production side of it, I oftentimes see almost monthly indicators at the tail end of the war. We will accept this kind of payment, but not that. And our rates have now doubled again this month due to hyperinflation in the South. While a transient paper might not reflect much information on the subscriber who wished to donate that issue, I wondered how selections and annotations of clippings in lent books told you something about the intent of the lender. Whether the bonds between soldier or the bonds between husband and wife or father and child, studies of the Civil War have illustrated the ways in which the war's disruptions forced individuals to profess feelings they might not have spoken in the context of ordinary relations uninterrupted by the war. How did familial relationships get described and redefined over the course of the war, even at the prescriptive level? Are they, and I'll get to this here in a second, but are they changing the tone and tenor of what they send? This might also shade into religion, since many scholars have looked at Southern Protestantism in particular as either the Confederacy's shield, a sort of evangelical martyrdom where Christian belief, the Confederacy, and eternal life fuse, or the Confederacy's Achilles heel, where a sort of gloomy providentialism takes hold of the South as reverses occur that make them believe they are no longer a favored cause. As individuals clipped out articles or sent papers, how did discussions of piety and family turn in both quantity and the nature of what they were discussing about the war? Did they start clipping more about heaven and less about politics or other news of what was happening? One of the richest vignettes in the paper occurs at the close as Mary and Ronald profile African-American abolitionist Charlotte Fortin, getting her hands on the Liberator as she prepared to instruct former slaves in South Carolina. While the paper was no doubt a dear intellectual friend, I also think this must have seemed to all involved a portent of a world turned upside down. Fortin knew that abolitionist activities and abolitionist literature had been threatened with death and destruction in the South for nearly 3 decades at this point. Now she could not only celebrate a sense of community and a sense of mission, but also a sense of personal subversion and social regeneration in the South that she was playing a key role in. After all, in the eyes of white Southerners, a black female abolitionist educating freed people in the Low Country was just as radical as a former slave carrying a Union rifle with a Union uniform. By way of conclusion here, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm up to and what I've taken away from this as I think about my own work. While the Southern evangelical newspapers I work with all aim for 10,000 subscribers, although I think only a couple get there, it's always the mark they want, they echo many of the ideas in these 2 fine papers. On one hand, like Benjamin Bridge, they seek peace and perfection in a chaotic and imperfect world. There is no problem that cannot be solved by print. There's this unbounded optimism about print in this period. So they will convert the Pope to Protestantism. They will make drunkards into teetotalers, and lay members will finally pay their clergymen a living wage. All the problems we solve, if only enough papers are distributed and they get in the right hands at the right place at the right time. But there is an ongoing challenge of production and distribution that has echoes of Mary and Ronald's findings. Even with the approach of the Civil War, Southern evangelicals promoted what they perceived as a universal message through missionaries to the Chinese and the Cherokees. The call went out to keep newspapers, Bible, and tract societies united to achieve efficiencies of scale that would allow Southern denominations to rival their Northern counterparts. And yet, every clergyman with a few dollars in his pocket cited the unmet needs of local parishioners as the call for yet one more Baptist or Methodist newspaper that I then have to go track down. We have been reminded today by both of these fine papers how American authors, publishers, and readers, even those on the margins from Worcester, Massachusetts in the 1790s to Washoe City, Nevada during the Civil War, continue to shape self and society in American culture. And I thank you for your papers. All right. I think, do you wish to sort of quickly touch on my points, or do you want to open it to the floor?
I'd like to open to the floor.
Okay.
A question from the Zboray's paper. Given that you're, and maybe this is a little tangential, but I'm not sure. Given that one of your major claims is that this, maybe like casual, unofficial sort of dissemination of print is a kind of an alternative to commercial exchange of print, and one that's increasingly important in this time. I wonder if you've thought about, or if you could talk about, how objects take on value, or the sort of multiple ways maybe in which objects take on value in this informal network of print distribution. The thing that really provoked this question for me was the case of the slave who is negotiating his way towards free territory by giving away papers along the way, right? It seems to me in that particular instance, the papers have become currency, and a way that he can sort of get through if I'm reading the anecdote right, get through hostile territory by sort of basically paying his way through by, and that seems to me like maybe one way, and a particular, even peculiar way that these objects take on value, where in many other instances there's much more kind of vague and maybe complicated kinds of value at stake, such as sentimental value, et cetera, as opposed to the kind of commercial value that maybe we can look at as trying to firm itself up in the years leading up to the Civil War and kind of losing ground in the years of the Civil War. So I throw that out to you all as a question.
Well, as we're doing the Civil War project, we're realizing that the value of print has has a different meaning in the war than it did in the antebellum years, because it was more stable in the antebellum years. So legacies of print that were handed down from generation to generation, of course, acquired value, as you said, through the family connections. During the war, there was a lot of disruption of that kind of inheritance and legacy. We're finding, though, that it didn't mean people didn't value these books as much, but that they had to find new ways of holding on to that value. One of the more heartbreaking aspects of it is the destruction of libraries and legacies to be handed down, and how they are the meanings renegotiated by ending up in enemy hands. So I think that's a new take on the meaning of value. And then also another sense of the meaning of value, ephemeral print takes on a whole lot more of a weight of value during the war. Before, we noticed in our antebellum research, people did not want to mention that they read newspapers because it was considered, here today, gone tomorrow, it was desultory reading, so it didn't lead to a whole course of reading that helped you become a better person, more knowledgeable and wise. But during the war, all of that was thrown by the wayside. In fact, people would say they value newspapers extremely because they tell them about their loved ones on the battlefield. So in that sense, the value increased tremendously during the war. I don't know if it led to a greater preservation of those newspapers. I don't so far see evidence necessarily of that, because people bound their newspapers in the antebellum period. And I suppose they did during the Civil War. We know people did save them for future generations, but it was often harder to do so, especially if you were a soldier. You got that call to march and get your rations together, and if you just had a bounty of newspapers coming in, they were scattered on camp.
One of the great images is we have several accounts of where people, the army had moved on, and they left their camp, and in the camp they described the newspapers floating around as if this was their effluvia. They left those newspapers, which had lost value because, as Mary was saying, that their information timeliness is a big part of the value of this print culture because the news is so important.
Yes.
Question for Robb. Great paper, really enjoyed it. What I love about this is that it leaves us this question. It's like, well, why wasn't the printed page enough, right? Why was he not happy with that? And I'm curious what, I think I love the range of options you sort of go through, and you're not quite ready to say, well, he's an insecure 18-year-old boy.
That comes into play.
But is it, because I wonder if the other part of it, though, to give him credit, to say, I want to know if you think he's an insecure 18-year-old boy, but also, is it because of the publishing conventions at the time, that he has to publish under pseudonyms in order to participate, that he can't link his name to it? And I'm also curious if you thought about it in relation to other textual forms. Is this the beginning of his collected works? Is that a genre that is popular at the time that he might be sort of aping?
Very possible. I mentioned this other figure in New York, Richard Bingham Davis. He dies, I mentioned 1799 of yellow fever. His colleagues in the Calliopean Society collect his poems, and they put out an advertisement in 1800 saying, we are going to publish a commemorative volume of Davis's verse. This comes out in 1800, I think, or 1801. Ultimately, this volume, posthumous volume of his poetry, is not actually published until 1807. So this was the case for Davis, and it's very possible that Bridge was thinking along similar lines, that this could be at least a manuscript publication of his verse. And in terms of you mentioned why print is not enough. Why does he produce this volume? Well, I think your comment, it might go back to what Scott mentions as well regarding his economic status. And even though, as I mentioned, I believe he does have a personal relationship with the printer and bookseller Isaiah Thomas. As I mentioned, their family shared pews in the local church. Bridge obviously was purchasing books from Thomas's local store. Nonetheless, I sincerely doubt that he would have been able to afford a subscription to the magazine itself, that this might have been beyond his means. Because I imagine that if he did have a subscription, that it's quite possible that it would have been the magazine itself that was circulating among his friends and family. So he could say, look, I'm in print, here's my work. And I believe because his, as mentioned, he is the youngest of several children, and while his father is well respected within Worcester's community and has certainly achieved a degree of competency, they're not necessarily a wealthy family. His father is practicing as a barber and wig maker, is his main line of trade. So I think that it's ultimately economic hardship that would have prevented him from subscribing and circulating the magazine itself, hence the reliance more on the scribal volume, which only cost him 2 shillings.
Go ahead.
Rob, I'm sorry if I missed this in your paper, which I very much enjoyed, but what convinced you that this manuscript volume was more than a private record?
Well, I think that just in terms, and this is looking at other volumes, scribal volumes that I've looked at during this period. I've looked at several commonplace books, and they don't have the eloquence. There doesn't seem to be the time put in terms of the transcription, in terms of the thought regarding the design and layout of the pieces themselves. And ultimately, you're right, I don't have any direct evidence that this work was circulated among friends and family. Yet, the entries that accompany each transcribed poem or essay, where he says, I sent the following piece to the editor of the Massachusetts Magazine in July 1792, and it appeared in the following issue, to me is highly suggestive that this was not done just for his personal viewing, that this was an indication for other people that, as lovely as the scribal volume is, this is the product of an author in print as well.
Yes, Diane.
I have a question for Rob. It may spill over to a question for the Zborays as well. I also was fascinated by what you were working with, and I get that there are a couple of things that I want to ask. When I first saw your title, what I assumed that you'd be talking about is William Manning, who is one of these, for people who read in this period, he's one of these iconic, not published authors. He's this North Massachusetts farmer who writes a piece he calls The Key of Liberty and keeps trying to get a magazine to publish it, and no one will publish it. And what he is in fact arguing is that those of us who aren't Federalists are getting shut out of this country. We need to create Republican associations to compete with the clubs through which the Federalists do their work. And he can't find anybody who's willing to put his version of that in print, because it's a very working class idea of what Republican associations are supposed to do. So I get, thinking of someone like Manning, who is not trying to establish that belletristic reputation, but he's got something to say in a more public sphere kind of mode. How does he fit into these kind of networks that you're looking at. And I'm also, related to that, I'm also trying to figure out what counts as failure in these situations. Because with Manning, the manuscript was still around for Samuel Eliot Morison to transcribe in the 20th century. That somebody kept this thing, and somebody kept Benjamin Bridges' books. So there is a certain amount of success there in that, this doesn't just get burned when these people die. It is, in some ways, bouncing off Kyle's point, is creating the manuscript really a mark of failure or damage control, or trying to make sure that something else happened? Or is this just, you have print to talk to one set of people and you have manuscript to talk to another set of people? So it's actually, going back to the first panel, a matter of multiple publics that are being addressed, rather than I'm going to do it just in case, I don't make it in print, at least I have manuscript that maybe there's, the failure and success seem to get incredibly complicated in this world.
Well, it's also, I don't know that at this point, Bridge, I don't believe, ever thought of his writing as a money-making venture at this time, or something that he would take up as a full-time occupation. And this goes back to your question about whether print or his magazine writing is complementary or competitive in terms of his legal career. And certainly, being a well-read individual, having the exquisite handwriting that he does certainly is an asset for his legal career. But at the same time, he is an itinerant lawyer. He is traveling throughout Massachusetts. And I believe that this was occurring right at the time that he ends his submissions to the Massachusetts Magazine. And that when you have, this is why his scribal publication is only 5 works, is limited to this amount. I think at this point, his work as a lawyer, and particularly the fact that he had to travel throughout the Commonwealth, this took up all his time and left little for Bellette. And I think this is to pick up on the question you asked about audiences. I think that ultimately, even though scholars have pointed out in my own work with magazines, even though many of these publications that are appearing that are local or regional, sent by local or regional contributors, in most cases I found that individuals, the readers themselves, knew or had a pretty good idea who the actual authors were. Okay? My sense is that readers in Boston and throughout Massachusetts would not have known Benjamin Bridge. He has not been able to establish himself as a lawyer. He's still a relatively young man. I think there is a bit of anxiety and uncertainty that this is a way to prove himself in the scribal publication. So in that sense, I think that circulating the work among the local community was important, that this was, in a sense, his own version of the Massachusetts Magazine. And I'm sorry, the other component of your question was?
Dealing with Manning, trying to think about what to do with people who aren't necessarily aiming for that belletristic recognition, but are really trying to do the political, the stuff that Thomas says he's not doing with this magazine. What about the people, the Benjamin Bridges, who are interested in that kind of publication?
Most of the magazines that are coming out prior to 1794 are trying to avoid the open partisan politics of the time, and you see this in the editorials that appear in these magazines and in the prospectuses, where the editors say, we are going to, with the function of our magazine is to promote manners, morality, improve the minds of our citizens. We are going to try to avoid this overtly partisan or controversial issues like politics, like religion. They would say that there's already a venue. The newspapers provide a public outlet for discussing political affairs. So, for the most part during this time, the magazines do tend to avoid largely overtly political themes, political events. Although once you get past 1794, they do take a stronger political stance. Having said that, if you look at magazines like Matthew Carey's American Museum, as well as the Massachusetts magazine, Isaiah Thomas, their editors are strongly Federalist in their outlook.
Just in the back.
Rob, Mary, an observation and then a question. The shared reading experiences among the Civil War soldiers, Confederate as well as Union, tend to get replicated in the small towns that establish social libraries after the war is over. You see, the people who established them were usually Civil War veterans, so there's a connection there, I'm certain. The social libraries then, when the women come in with the women's clubs, become public libraries in the late 19th century. So there's a continuum, as I see, that, from what you observed with the diaries. The second one, though, a couple of years ago I reviewed a book on 19th century anti-obscenity legislation. And a good share of the post-bellum obscenity legislation, the author argued, was in shocked response at the volume of pornography that circulated among Civil War camps. Did you find any of this in the diary?
Among the Bibles?
Well, I mean, the thing, of course, what's obscene is a matter of cultural difference, and so many of the items that would be seen as obscene would be the yellow pamphlet novels, like Eugene Sue was one of the more scandalous authors of the time. We might not think of it that way. How obscene? We don't know. I mean, I don't know.
We didn't, well, the nature of the material, I think, that we're looking at might not be as candid about those kinds of things, especially letters home. I don't think anyone's going to although the soldiers were often questioned by their wives a lot about prostitution, and were they, and I've read about this in the newspaper, and are you doing this? Or,
and he says, oh no.
Yeah, right. Everyone always said no. We did get some hints at it, where soldiers talked about other soldiers saying, oh, he got his yellow novel, and he's just really happy now. He's content. He's sitting there reading it. But yeah, like really candid statements, no. I don't think we found that. We have found it for prostitution, which is interesting. But for the reading matter, not that I can think of offhand. But if I do, I'll search through our material.
But that's a good point about the genealogy into the social library afterwards, because there is the kind of beginnings of the organizations. We see that a lot in the prisons. We have a lot of people who are reading in prisons. You see them almost creating reading clubs in the middle of prisons just to get by with the boredom, so that could easily translate institutionally afterwards.
Yeah, and also related to that point, what we're finding is that the soldiers are actually keeping more traditional patterns alive of literary culture than the civilians are. They're moving more into the modern age of solitary reading. So soldiers, I think, were much more interested in maintaining those social units of reading. And so I could really see why veterans would be the ones to really want to establish those libraries.
Can I pick that up in terms of what Jim and I have been doing with the what Middletown read? I think we do have the ledgers of the board of the library. One of the very interesting things is that the local post of the GAR, the General Army of the Republic, had a library which they then donated to I think in the 1890s, to the Muncie Public Library. Strangely, it was there for about a year and a half, and they had to make special arrangements that soldiers who were not members of the library could actually borrow books. And then for a reason which we haven't really been able to fathom, the library was then removed from the Muncie Public Library. I don't think there was anything sinister about it, because a member of the GAR shortly after was the president of the Muncie Public Library. But for whatever reason, the books were deposited. And I think we even have the list of the books that were given to the library, although it seems temporarily. As I say, I don't know why they removed them. But that's an example of the kind of thing that Wayne is talking about, and we have the very specific records. And that ledger is now available through the Digital Media Repository at Ball State, so you can read it online.
Thank you for telling us.
And just to add one other quick to the flip side of what Wayne and Frank were talking about, I think the subscription libraries really seem to die at the Civil War, because so many subscribers either go off to fight, or their finances are destroyed, or they're using their money for other things. And that certainly happened with the library that I've done work with in Easton, Pennsylvania. The 1862 just kind of fizzles out, and the local school winds up taking over the collection. So there really does seem to be some sort of hinge. The debate is still raging as to what happens with literary production, but it does seem something with reading really is changing during those years.
Yeah, I think the soldiers really wanted it to stay alive, and they would imagine people on the home front still, engaging in the same practices of literature, when actually they had themselves buried in newspapers all the time. And they would ask, well, what are you reading? Can we read the same thing at the same time on the same night? And really, a lot of the civilians would respond, well, I can't really keep up with you. And I think that the culture was changing rapidly like that.
All right. Next.
Oh, yes, I just wanted to ask a question about, I was interested that you said they were afraid of what might happen to their Bibles if they fell into the wrong hands. And as a kind of gloss to my previous comment about what happened in New Zealand, during the New Zealand Wars, Maori used pages from the Bible to make cartridges, which I admire as an act of resistance. I think it's extremely eloquent. But I wondered what it was that they were afraid might happen to their Bibles, and have you found any evidence of that?
Well, I mean, they had they would be talking about their Bible and their Bible reading a lot in their correspondence, and so they were identified with this item. Many times it was a loved one who had given them a Bible on parting. So this was a token of a connection to home. So we do have a lot of evidence of soldiers just saying that this is, just to conceive that the Bible is going to fall into the hands of the enemy is one of the worst possible images they can have. It's almost like they themselves are falling in the hands. And there are instances of where after a battle, people went on the battlefield and they didn't find the body, but they found the Bible. And that verified that at least this person was there and this person might be missing.
Which I would add suggests a couple of things. One is the central role of religion because of its transcendence. I mean, I see a lot of my materials pray at the same time, right? The same way of communication through Christian ideals and to connect family at a time of increasing domesticity in this period that I think enhances that level of communication. So you have this not only connection and network, but intimacy and sacredness, all bound up in one document. That and I think, with scholarship increasingly looking at the nature of a sort of religious war and the ways in which religion was undergirding some of the values here, that may also add to a political sensibility about the statement of somebody getting a hold of those. Yes.
This is also for Mary and Ronald. Just thinking, it was wonderful to actually find evidence of the way that the social mediation of value and meaning of these print objects. But I was wondering about what kinds of value and meaning people were ascribing to them. Just wondering if you found any evidence of people particularly clipping things to disagree with them or argue with them, as opposed to sort of the clipping being evidence of approval or what people were trying to communicate with these kinds of clippings, whether there were readings against the grain.
I'm sure that's there. There was one argument that went back and forth between a soldier and a woman who was a friend of his on the home front. And it was over politics, and he kept insisting, well, she's a Democrat, she will never change, and he was a Republican, pro-Lincoln. And yes, in that case, the clippings were against the belief system. Yeah, it wasn't always, I'll read this and we can all agree. A lot of times. And in another paper, I think, that we wrote, we made the argument that clippings were sometimes ways of gently letting people know my opinions have changed, or this, someone would send a clipping of the role they had in a rally, which was not of the same political sort as the person that they were in contact with. And so you sent the clipping instead of your own written words, and it was a little bit easier to take. But yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
In the back, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a related question, and I guess it goes back to Pat's question to start, which was the value of the print object. And I was really struck by what you said, Scott, about Charlotte Fortin's, the status of the object for Charlotte Fortin in the South as an African American woman at a moment, when the injunctions against teaching slaves to read would have surely still been in the back of everyone's minds, and the idea of insurrection, how that contrasts with the idea of the newspaper as waste material on the battlefield. There's one scene that you mentioned that I can't figure out exactly, and I was hoping if you could say, what on earth were they doing when they went and ransacked people's homes and took not only newspapers, but the bound books? I think you said the quote was something about some of the nice books. The handsome books sitting on the table. What is the status of those book objects?
Yeah, we have a lot of information about that, a lot of negotiation about putting them into the Adams Express box, and instructions about sending them home, and they're going to become part of the person's library. It's war bounty, and it creates like a whole new genealogy for these books. They're like they're going to enter the family, be part of the story of this person being down there at that time. But a lot of times they liked the books they were sending home too. So I mean, it had like a dual function. There was the relic as well as something a book they'd like to own that they probably couldn't afford.
Yeah, a lot of them were very valuable. That they were, and Jameson's illustrated art book was one which was really expensive. But your point about the value too, it is baffling. I don't understand really how those books could have been transformed into something that was owned by a family that was the enemy of the people that it was taken from. How does one erase all of the social imprint that was there before, and the political imprint of that volume? That I can't quite get into their heads to understand how that actually took place. But
I've come across at least one example of that being inscribed over. There's a London illustrated edition of Evangeline I came across once that had written the flyleaf. I found this book in the house in Savannah when our Corps moved in and made it our headquarters on such and such date.
Yeah.
Well, it also seems to be that the notion of a hard war, right? I mean, so it's not just taking physical slaves away, but also taking the most prized possessions, as you showed here, destroying the book, the valuable bookcase, and the very fact that the other side placed so much importance on it becomes something then of just taking away, even if it's not the value to the individual.
Right, and that would explain too why sometimes these things were just destroyed, just for the vengeance of the destruction, even if they were valuable items. And that did happen too, where books were just thrown out windows and torn apart.
Working later, I work in later 19th century American lit, and the changing object status of the regional book in the 1880s and 1890s with the rise of American local color writing. I mean, the argument has long been that the production of local color was part of a national reunification project, and in that instance, the book becomes not just a conveyor of information, but it becomes like an anthropological object that one can put into the museum, the National Literary Museum of the magazine. So that could be the roots of this changing object status.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about the role of the post office and race and gender, for all of you, but specifically, I think, for Ron and Mary. My understanding from my limited knowledge reading Richard John's book, and not really anything more recent, is that women found it difficult to go into post offices to mail things themselves, certainly before the Civil War, and maybe after the Civil War also. I mean, it was not considered respectable for a woman to go into the mail area of the post office where people could be smoking and reading salacious materials that had been posted through. And so women had to find an intermediary to do their mailing for them. So that might reflect on your writers in 1790 who still needed, women writers needed a male agent to effect that communication with publishers. But I wondered, from Ron and Mary, whether you saw any shift of an increase in women's agency by enabling them to go to the post office in the absence of men who would otherwise perhaps have done that for them. And then my other question is, what was it like for African Americans to use the post office, either in the South or in the North, sort of more or less at any time?
Well, in terms of the 1863 July is a very important turning point for postal laws, because for the first time you get city delivery. And you're also getting a system in which you can drop things into boxes. So it's, in a way, that kind of obviates the whole question about that. In the rural areas, though, the post offices were very informal. So they might be in grocery stores or in other kinds of venues that women were constantly going to. So we, in terms of the beyond the Metropolis thing, that's almost never something that would come up because of the dense social networking that takes place. I'm not sure it would be before 1863 that we might have some trouble with women getting things in urban post offices. What about the African Americans?
African American posting, that I can't think offhand of specific evidence to that effect. I know that Charlotte Fortin certainly posted a lot of things. We're very familiar with her diary from the antebellum period and into the Civil War. I don't recall her talking about it. She certainly met with problems in public culture in the South.
Philadelphia.
Well, Philadelphia. She called it the South almost because she felt that there was a lot more racial prejudice in Philadelphia than in Salem, which she made her adoptive home. But no, otherwise I don't think we have any evidence about specifically African American use. But that would be something we really should try to investigate. That's a great point.
All right. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of women posting their works, sending in their works to the magazine editors and the printers, it does seem that, at least regarding the Massachusetts Magazine, that individuals like Judith Sargent Murray, Elizabeth Graham Ferguson were, I don't know the actual means by which they were physically sending their submissions. However, they do write direct letters accompanying their pieces to the editors, and they will not sign their names. They will use a pseudonym such as Constantia or Philenia, and they will be acknowledged in the magazine itself, normally in the first page of the magazine. Right across from the table of contents, there is a section that says for correspondence. And you will see something along the lines of Philenia is thanked for her contributions. And to take that one step further, in terms of book authorship, I've seen examples with Elizabeth Graham Ferguson and others where women are trying to take the next step from magazine authorship to book authorship, and here they do need the intermediary of a male figure, of a friend or a family member, to negotiate with a printer on their behalf.
All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. We're at the point here where we're going to go to lunch, and so we can continue the conversation over a meal and break here. But I want to thank the presenters for excellent papers and comments. Thank you.